After all this time of waiting, it is now time I finish this personal pantheon series of the gods that I hold in direct reverence and worship, and move on to one I feel is most important in my connection, the one I hold in the highest respects, the god Fenrir, the Bound One, the World Eater. With titles such as this, it's not too hard necessarily to find most to be in terror and fear of such a god that would eventually bring the destruction of all that is known. Well, obviously it would make many terrified to even think of such a being. But, to me, he is not entirely evil. In some ways, there are things that I wish to speak of to put him in a better light, but let me first explain how he came to be and where he is first referenced. Fenrir is a son of Loki, and he did not start out in his punishments, but close enough, may as well. Fenrir originally was a revered member, an important friend of the most important god at the time, Tyr. However, eventually Odin had returned from his time at Yggdrasil, after hanging himself for 9 days, refusing food and drink, and even piercing his own flesh with his own spear, Gungnir. He had received the language of the dead, a very powerful language known as the Elder Futhark, which is still used for divinations to this day. The magic of the Elder Futhark runes were passed to him, and thus he was able to obtain great knowledge. However, in so doing, he also was given one other gift from the three sisters of fate, one that can be considered both a blessing and a curse. The end of Asgard and Midgard, and exactly how it would happen. It would happen with the three children of Loki and Loki himself to be present and to bring the destruction of both realms in one go. Odin, upon his return, obviously had to do something. He felt he needed to make sure that there would be as few variables as possible so that he could possibly prevent the fate of Asgard and Midgard, but obviously, as we know in many of these kinds of religion, fate is not necessarily something you can avoid, and the Norse especially know very well that fate is something you cannot avoid. But Odin was more than willing to try anyway. He first started with Jormungandr, the brother of Fenrir, the World Serpent. He tossed him into the ocean, and Jormungandr for a time would grow in size and magnitude, eventually encompassing the world and encompassing the sea at the edge of the world, biting his own tail in order to maintain its stability. Hel would be given her own realm outside of Asgard. Hel would run her own queendom, caring for the infirm, the sick, and the feeble, basically making sure that those who died a peaceful death would be given sanctuary after their deaths, but at a price. None be able to leave her realm without her permission, and she is most certainly not one willing to give her subjects away easily. And then finally, there is Fenrir. For a time no punishment came for him because of his connection to Tyr. Their friendship and their bond kept them close, and even they considered each other as brothers. In fact, while the other gods began to fear Fenrir as he grew in size and in strength, Tyr was the only one who wished to be with him because of how close they were. Odin, however, desired to do something about Fenrir, knowing that he was one of the variables that needed to be taken care of, and so he came up with a plan to deal with this. He decided to make a challenge that Fenrir would not be able to bust out of any chain that could be given to him. A challenge of strength. Fenrir accepted this and proudly challenged each and every single set of chains that were given to him. He tested each of them, and each time he would break free of these chains. Odin became worrisome and realized that this was not going to be a good enough plan to take care of Fenrir. and so he decided to come up with another way of handling the issue. He went to the dwarves and asked for them to create a magical binding, as regular bindings were not enough. And so the dwarves returned to him with a magical ribbon. This ribbon was presented before Fenrir by Odin himself. Fenrir saw this as an affront to his strength, and was suspicious, because why present him with a feeble, weak-looking ribbon unless there was something more to it? And so he decided that he would accept this challenge, but on one condition: that one of the gods offer their hands as a form of trust. And so Tyr, being a god of justice and honor, offered his hand. Fenrir had the ribbon wrapped around him, and Tyr presented his hand. Tyr, probably knew of what was going on, and perhaps through guilt decided to offer some compensation, some act of revenge in order to appease the brother that he cared for so deeply. Fenrir struggled against this ribbon in surprise and shock. He tried and tried against the magic ribbon, but to no avail, as the ribbon would not even show a fracture of damage. No sort of tear, nor wear, no damage. The gods mocked and laughed at him. And Fenrir, in his frustration at how they mocked him, how they jeered him, he bit deeply into Tyr's hand. And so Tyr wailed and he cried in pain at the loss of his hand. And this wasn't just his regular hand, it was his sword hand. And thus, Tyr had lost something valuable to him, not just his hand, but also a brother. Fenrir, after this, had a sword shoved into his maw, piercing from the top to the bottom, thus he could never open it, to take revenge on the gods. And thus afterwards Fenrir would be taken to the darkest caverns of Helheim, and there he would wait, imprisoned, bound, and in anger and rage against the gods who had unjustly punished him, waiting for the day of his release on Ragnarok, where he would slay Odin, consume Midgard, the sky, the sun, and the moon, and only be brought to an end by Vadir, the silent god of revenge and son of Odin. Fenrir would eventually fall, and his end would be prophesied to come. So why do I honor this god, then? And why do I see him as a god? He is not specifically listed as god. Well, it's all a matter of perspective to me. Whereas the Asatru may not necessarily see a god in Fenrir, I, however, see a god of quite a few properties. For example, Tyr is a god of justice and honor, a god of truces and law. However, I see on the other side, for Fenrir. Fenrir to me is a god of revenge, a god who looks after those who have been unjustly punished for crimes they have not committed or crimes they have yet to commit, or even for suffering punishments for a crime that does not fit the magnitude. Fenrir is a god that undoes the injustice of the status quo, or eventually he will. This is what leads me to see Fenrir in the greatest aspect, and why I am mostly drawn to him. There are many things that are listed in his tale that see to me a god worthy of worship, a god that has truly suffered because of the world, that has suffered because of fate, and that has suffered because of those that he held closely to him. He is a god that has been betrayed by nearly everything and everyone. He is a god that suffers for things he has not committed or has yet to commit. And so I see a god that desires revenge because there is no other way of receiving the justice he desires. The gods will not be punished unless by his hand. And so, that is where I see relation with him, where I see him as a father figure. I too have suffered these kinds of injuries. I have received betrayal from family, a father that was willing to abandon his children for a woman that does not even love him. I have been betrayed by a country that promised these wonderful, valuable things of freedom and equality, only to realize the reality that those things were not true, and that those were merely lies in order to cover up the reality that they do not value those things and that they are willing to take them at a moment's notice, for the sake of those that already have everything. And then finally, betrayal by a god I cared so deeply for, gave my worship and reverence to for decades of my life, and yet only to figure out he is not even the god that I honored him as, to realize that his message wasn't merely corrupted by man, but that his message from the very beginning was corrupt because the god himself was corrupt. There is nothing I feel but hatred for a god like that. And so Fenrir and I have felt a close kinship because of it. And of course through the friendship that Tyr and Fenrir originally had. And so it is because of that I have felt that in the afterlife there is no one I wish to revere to be in the presence of after I die more than Fenrir. To be a guardian of his, to protect him, and also to be the one around him even after he falls. It is to Fenrir I wish to dedicate my life to, and dedicate my afterlife to. Fenrir, a god that I know will die someday. A god I will grieve and mourn every single day knowing that his end will come, and there is nothing I can do to stop it. But one thing I do at least wish to have is to be by his side, even to the end. Though I know of what will happen in the end, I still wish to at least be someone who wishes to bring some sort of justice to those who do not have it. And that is the most important thing I find for Fenrir. For Fenrir, he is a representation of those whom have not been given their due, who have been unjustly punished, for those that have not been able to receive their own justice. He is a reminder that justice does not come for all, and that sometimes justice isn't enough, that sometimes revenge is what ends up being the necessary element in order to receive the justice that you'd so desperately need. Not the path for all, but sometimes it is a path that must be taken. And that is why I revere Father Fenrir as I do.